Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and we will be learning today. We'll be completing Lamed Ches Amid Beis as well as Lamed Tes Amid Aleph. In the previous share, my recording cut out on me in the middle due to a lack of room on my hard drive. I record directly to the hard drive of the computer, and every share is rather large. Apparently, I ran out of memory without realizing it. So we were rudely interrupted in the midst of Siman Chav Zayin Sif Yud Aleph. So we're up to Lamed Ches Amid Beis, Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Tes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read from the beginning of the Mechaber's words, Sif Yud Aleph, Lamed Ches Amid Beis, 3 lines down, just for the sake of continuity, and then we'll dive straight into Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Tes. Says the Mechaber Sif Yud Aleph. Tzarech sheyiyeh hashachor sheberitzuos litzad chutz v'lo yishapchu. The ritzuos should be turned so that the black side is facing outwards. That's the side of the ritzuos that should be showing, not the unfinished side, either the white side or even for those that have ritzuos that are blackened on both sides. One side is more beautiful than the other. It's a different type of polish. The blackened side is the side that should be facing outwards. Now, then the Mechaber continues and he says, this is Bein Shal Yad, Bein Shal Rosh. This halacha applies both to the ritzuos of the Shal Yad and to the ritzuos of the Shal Rosh. Now, in Mishnah Berurah's Katan Lamed Ches, the Chavetz Chaim told us that we have to understand which part of the ritzuos the Mechaber is referring to. Really, me'ikar adin, the only part of the ritzua that has to be with the black side facing out are the ritzuos that encircle the head, the part that makes the keshira, the tying of the tefillin onto the head. Those ritzuos have to have the black side out. They should not be inverted. So too on the shal yad, the ritzuos that encircle the arm, that tie the bias of the shal yad onto the arm, those are the ritzuos that should not be inverted. But let's say the rest of the ritzuos that hang down from the shal rosh, over there the Mishnah Berurah Katan Lamed Ches says, Ein tzarich lahakpid. We don't have to worry about it if that's facing the wrong way. So too the ritzuos of the shal yad, the ritzuos that make the krichos, the windings around the arm, the Mishnah Berurah says, Ein lahakpid. We don't have to worry about it. But at the end of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Lamed Ches, he does say, Umikal makom mishum noi ha-mitzvah, as far as beautifying the mitzvah of Tefillin, Roi lahapar shia hashachar l'tzad chutz afilu b'hamoisar, it is proper to have the blackened side facing outwards, even on the moisar. The word moisar means the extras, the extra part of the ritzuos that are not required me'ikar adin. So let's say the windings of the arm or the ritzuos that hang down from the shal rosh, because of noi mitzvah, those also should be facing the proper direction. And now we go to where we had left off. We go to Ois Katan Lamed Tes. The Mechaber told us that this halacha applies Bein Shal Yad, Bein Shal Rosh. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hine b'Shal Yad, when it comes to the Tefillin Shal Yad, Shuhu Raya Keshuhu Meiniach, when you put on the Tefillin Shal Yad, you can look and you can see what you're doing. So, by the Tefillin Shal Yad, Yachal Lirois, you can see, Shalo Yishapech Loya Kesher V'Loy Haritzua, that when you put on the Tefillin, you can see that in the Makayim of the Keshira, where you tighten the loop on the Ritzua to tighten the Tefillin Shal Yad onto your hand, you could see if the loop became inverted. And the part of the Ritzua that's going around the arm, also, you can see if it became inverted. But, Ubishal Rosh, when it comes to the Tefillin Shal Rosh, you cannot see. When you put the Shal Rosh on around your head, you can't see those ritzuos, right? You have eyes here. You can't see what's going on up here. Therefore, it says the Chavetz Chaim, Yemashmesh heitev b'yadai, you should feel well with your hands. Mimokayim haketzitza, from the point at which the ketzitza, the bias, is sitting on the head, b'chol tzad, you should run your fingers around your head, along the ritzua, the yargish, and you should feel imunachin karoi if they are laying properly and you don't have a twist so that the white side is facing out. Now we continue in the Mechaber. It says the Mechaber continuing Sif Yod Aleph. Yeshalshel haritzuais, you should drape the ritzuas downward from the sharosh. Sheyu teluyim lefanav, so that they should be hanging in front of you. V'yagiu ad hatabor, and the Mechaber says that the ritzuas should reach at least until the navel. Oyla maila mimenu ma'at, or maybe a little bit higher than that. So when you put on your sharosh, there are two ritzuas that are coming off of the kesher on the back of your head. Really, they could be hanging down in the back. The Mechaber says, no, you should pull them over your shoulder and you should drape them in front of you. And the Mechaber says that they should be long enough that they should reach ad hatabor until the navel. Or maybe a little bit higher. Says the Mishnah Berurah, mem ad hatabor. V'im hoisef al zeh. And if the ritzuas are longer than that, less lanba, that's not a problem. Oizkat mem aleph, oila maila mimenu. The Mechaber said it could be a little bit higher than the tabor. Vayin b'chedusha Rabbi Kiva eger v'chein ba'artzes achayim. He says you can take a look at the Rabbi Kiva and also the Malbim in the Artzes achayim. The maske, where they conclude the shal yamin ad hatabor, that the ritzua coming off of the sharosh on the right side should be long enough to reach the navel. Vishal smoil, and on the left side, ad hechazeh. It doesn't have to be any longer than the breastbone. Ubat Torah kasav oid, the Torah writes, v'yesh oimrim, there are those that say, dishal yamin ad hamila, that the right side ritzua should reach until the makayim hamila, vishal smoil ad atabor, and the left one should reach the navel. In both cases, what we see is that the right one is longer than the left one. Continues the Mechaber. Now the Mechaber discusses the minimum width of the ritzua, not the length, the width of the ritzua straps. Says the Mechaber, Roichav haritzuas shal yad v'shal roish. The minimum width of the ritzuas, both of the tefillin shal yad and the tefillin shal roish, ka'orech sa'ora lapachos. It should be at least the width of a barley corn. Now, a barley corn, well, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah over here. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cut membeis, ka'orech sa'ora. What do we mean when we speak of a barley corn? Hainu bikli pasa. We're not talking about a barley grain when you open up a bag on Erev Shabbos and you put the barley in your cholent. That barley grain is very, very tiny. But that's the barley grain when it's already removed from its sheath and its chaff. So that's very, very small. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we're talking about a barley corn bikli pasa, in its shell. So it has all of the outer parts of the grain still attached. Aval, however, baloi ha'ukitz shala, without the ukitz. The ukitz, if you look at a picture of barley, how it grows, there's the chaff, the sheath that has the barley grain inside it, and then there's a long ukitz. There's like a long thorn, a long piece that comes out. So if you take the barley grain together with that piece, it could be this long. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we're talking about a barley corn still encased in all of its chaff, but without that long piece still attached to it. How long is this? They bring down from the Chazon Ish approximately 10 millimeters. Others say about 9. Interestingly enough, the barley corn was a very, very highly accepted unit of measure back in the day in the United Kingdom. Interestingly enough, common shoe sizes are still based on the barley corn. So the barley corn, and by the way, I'm saying barley corn, which brings me to another interesting piece of trivia. Did you ever wonder why corned beef is called corned beef? What does corned beef have to do with corn? The answer is it has nothing to do with corn. Here in the United States, when we speak about salt, and we speak about an individual grain of salt, we call each grain a grain. It's a grain of salt. That's not the word that's used in the UK. In the UK, it's a corn of salt. So the word corn is used as grain. So a barley corn is a barley grain. The reason why corned beef is called corned beef is because corned beef dates back to the UK. Salt beef or something was a staple in the British Navy, because how did you have meat for sailors when they were out at sea for months at a time? They would preserve the meat in salt, so it was salt beef. And again, since a grain of salt is a quart of salt, it became corned beef, beef that was preserved in corns of salt. So the barley corn was a very, very well accepted unit of measure. The accepted length of a barley corn in UK measurements, I believe, is approximately 9 millimeters. And what we find in the Paiskim is anywhere from a little under 9 millimeters to approximately 10.5 millimeters. So that's the size of this sa'ira that we're referring to over here. Continues the Mishnah Berurah in Ice Cotton Membeis. He said it's the barley without the ukits. The yesh ba uktzin aruchim ma'oid, because those long pieces that come off of the grain are very, very long. So we don't count that. The yesh, I remember, there are those that say that we don't really need the width of a barley corn. We could go by the length of a wheat kernel, which is smaller than a barley corn. In pressing circumstances, we could rely on that psak. The kasva achraydim, the achraydim right. We have to take great care. Where we tighten the shalyad, the makom kefel hahiduk, where we fold back the ritzua and tighten it against the loop. We have to be very careful over there that we have the proper length of the ritzua. Sharagel shaharitzua niskamta sham. It is very common that the ritzua becomes niskamta, means it becomes shriveled. It becomes narrowed from pulling and stretching it. Aish and sekes, or it might even rip. Ad shaloi nishar ba kashir. It might rip in its width so that it is not yet torn in two, but you don't have enough of the width of the ritzua intact to maintain the minimum shear of a kisa oira. Okay, now we go weiter over here in the Mechaber in Sif Yod Aleph. So we're in the middle of the line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down in the Mechaber. In Piches Mishir Oirech HaRitzuas V'Rachban. If the Ritzuas become shortened either in their length or in their width. So we don't have this minimum size. Im Einoi Moitzi Acheros, says the Mechaber, if you cannot find any other Ritzuas to use, Menichan K'moi Shehein, you should put the Tefillin on with the Ritzuas as they are, Ad Sheyimtza Acheros Kashir, until you come by properly sized Ritzuas. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Kat Mem Gimel, Menichan, you should put them on even without the minimum shear. Why? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Mipnei sheyesh bach shirin, v'yesh paislin af b'di'eved. Because b'di'eved, we have paiskim that say that the tefillin are kosher without the minimum size of the ritzuas, and we have others that say it's possible even b'di'eved. Kimavur b'Beis Yosef, like we could find in the Beis Yosef, al kain hichriya kain. That's why the Mechaber, the Mechaber was machriya this way in the Shulchan Aruch, since we have a machlekes hapaiskim. So if you can't find other ritzuas, he paskins, you should put them on the way they are. Ois kat mem dalit k'may shahein v'achreinim maski. The achreinim conclude the empiches misher ha'oirich b'shal yad haniskar le'el b'sif ches. If you lack the minimum length of the tefillin shal yad that we learned about earlier in Sif Ches. What was the minimum length that we learned over there? We learned that you have to have enough ritzua that you could tighten the ritzua onto your arm. The ritzua has to encircle the arm so you can tie the bias on. Then you have to have enough ritzua to go straight down to the middle finger and to make 3 krichais on the middle finger. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here that the Achronim conclude, if you don't have that minimum length by the tefillin shal yad, yaniach b'loi bracha, you should put on the shal yad without a bracha. Now, what does it mean that you don't have that? Well, you have to have at least enough to tighten the bias onto the arm. If you don't have that, you can't put it on. But let's say you have enough to tighten the bias onto the arm, and you could come down a little bit, but you can't get to the middle finger, and you can't make the krichos. So you put it on without a bracha. If you have enough to get down to the middle finger and I guess make one wind around the middle finger, but you don't have enough to make the 3 winds, hakrichos ein ma'akvin, the winds around the finger are not ma'akiv, then you could still make a bracha. And when it comes to the absolute minimum size of the ritzuas for the tefillin sharosh, Kasav Bartzas Achayim, the Malbim writes, the dafke im yesh chutz bima shekamakif harosh, you have to have enough ritzua that you have the kesher intact on the back of the head, it goes around your head to tie the bias on, and then you have to have at least enough ritzuas coming off of the kesher, the dafke im yesh chutz bima shekamakif harosh. Besides what goes around the head, you have to have al kolpan at least keshir shnei tfachim. You have to have at least 2 tfachim, approximately 8 inches on each ritzua. Halavachi, yinachem b'loy bracha, but without that, you have to put it on without a bracha. Ule'inyan roichav haritzuas hashal yad v'hashal roish hechmer gamkein, and the Malbim is also machmer by the minimum size on the width of the ritzuas, by the shal yad and the shal roish. If you don't have the width of a barley corn, you only have the width of a grain of wheat, yanichen b'loy bracha ayin sham. How about if you can repair ritzuas? Can you stitch them together? We'll discuss that in greater detail in Siman Lamed Gimel of the Mishnah Berurah Sham. Okay, now we continue in the words of the Mechaber. We're 4 lines up from the bottom, about 2/3 of the way through the line. Tefillin sharosh. When it comes to the tefillin of the sharosh, toiv lihiyaisam galuyim v'nirim. It is good and proper that the tefillin sharosh should be visible and exposed. Aval, however, talmud b'fnei rabbi, if you have a talmud who is standing in front of his rebbe, ein derech eretz legalois tefillin b'fanav, it is not proper covered for the rebbe that the talmud should appear in front of the rebbe while he is wearing his tefillin sharosh uncovered. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton mem hey. The tefillin sharosh should be visible. Why? Diksiv, because the pasuk tells us v'ro kol amei haaretz, all of the nations of the world will see ki shem Hashem nira aleichem, that the name of Hashem is upon you. How will they see that? Because they'll see the sharosh. V'toiv, and it is also good shegam kesher yemagula. Interestingly enough, he says over here that the kesher of the sharosh should be exposed. Now, in order for the kesher of the sharosh to be exposed, you cannot have the talus draped over your head. Interesting. Aval ein noyag in kain, but we are talking not noyag that way. We're not noyag to leave the kesher of the sharosh exposed. Ubediavad avim hayu mechusim legamri yotza. But the evet, of course, your yotza, even if the sharosh is completely covered, both the bias and the kesher. The Mechaber said it is not proper derech eretz for a talmud to appear before his rebbe with the tefillin sharosh exposed. Shat tefillin heim derech kavod, because the wearing of the sharosh, that's very bakavadik. You know, how many does everybody realize that? What a great kavod it is to be able to wear a tefillin sharosh. We said earlier that there were those who would wait to make the bracha of Oiter Yisrael b'Sefara, to thank the Rabbanu Shalom for crowning us with glory. They waited to make that bracha until they put on the sharosh, because the sharosh is a crown of glory. So, a tefillin named derech kavod, kediksiv v'ro kol amei haaretz, ve'ein derech eretz lahashvos atzmoi l'rabbi. It wouldn't be proper derech eretz for a talmud to come in front of his rebbe wearing this crown the same way his rebbe is. Alkein, therefore, yechasai sam b'talizai, you should cover it with the talus or b'koiva, or with a hat. So said the Mechaber. But now let's take a look at the Ramah, 3 lines from the bottom near the end of the line. Haggah, says the Ramah. First of all, the Ramah says, Ubishal Yad. When it comes to the Shal Yad, the Ramah, interestingly enough, says, Ein lahakbid imheim galuyim oyim l'chusim. The Ramah brings down from the Mordechai that we don't have to be makbid if the Shal Yad is either covered or exposed. It could be either way. Okay, we'll have to take a look at that. But further, says the Ramah, the Nirali says, it appears to me, the Achshav, nowadays, she'ein manicham ela bizman kriya shema u'tfila. Nowadays, when we really only wear our tefillin during davening, we don't wear our tefillin all day. Even a Talmud could expose his shel roish in front of his Rebbe. And indeed, that is the minig, not to take care, not to be careful, not to expose the shel roish in front of your Rebbe. The reason is because now that we're wearing it only during davening, by Zman Kriya Shema and Zman Tefillah, that's a time when we're mechuyev to wear the shel roish. So we're not wearing the tefillin derech kavod, we're wearing the tefillin derech chiyuva. We're fulfilling our obligation. There's nothing wrong with showing our rabbeim that we're being mekayim the chiyuvei HaTorah. The only problem is if we're wearing it at a time when we're not strictly mechuyev to be wearing it, then it's taka oita Yisrael b'safara. Then it's a crown of glory. Crown of glory you don't appear in front of your Rebbe with. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois kat mem zayin ein lahakpid. The Ramah said we don't have to be makpid when it comes to the shalyad, that whether the shalyad is covered or not. Says the Mishnah Berurah, really l'chatchila it is better to cover the shalyad, and he brings this down in the Sharat Tzion from the El Yerabah and the Artzis HaChaim, the Malbim. Now we've seen this already before. The reason why the shalyad is supposed to be covered is because we learned from the pasuk, "V'hayu la'ois al yadecha u'l'taytafa yispeinenecha." V'hayu la'ois al yadecha. It should be an ois al yadecha, on your hand. And what we darshan from there is it's lecha la'ois. It should be an ois for you. V'loy la'acherim la'ois. But the shalyad is not an ois for other people. So you should know about your shalyad, but your shalyad should not be visible to others. The Ramah over here seems to say that you don't have to be makpid. I think there are those that want to suggest that maybe the Ramah meant he was only going back on the question of a Talmud l'fnei rabbi, but that's clearly not the way others learn it over here. If you take a look at the Sharat Tshuva brings down to Balavush Kasav Shiyum Mechusim Mishum V'Haya L'Chalais, that the tefillin shalyad are supposed to be covered. He brings down from the Arizal also that the tefillin shall. Right, yeah, it brings down from the Ari that the tefillin shalyad should be covered. Remember the Rishiva Zatzal Rav Moshe Zechariah Kodesh Levracha used to cover if for some reason it was out of his tefillin weren't inside the sleeve. He would drape the talus down over the shalyad and hold the talus with his arm. Instead of having it up on the shoulder, he would have it draped over the arm and hold the tefillin up, the tzitzit up, so the talus up, so the tzitzit shouldn't drag on the floor, but he would have the talus covering the shalyad. Ois kat mem ches, says the Mishnah Berurah, ein lahakpid im hem gluyim pirish shem nikru begadav leslon ba. I think this is what the Mishnah Berurah means to say over here. The Mishnah Berurah says when the Ramah says that you don't have to be makpid if the shalyad is covered or not, says the Mishnah Berurah, what does he mean? He doesn't mean that you should just go around with your tefillin shalyad exposed. No, of course you're going to cover the tefillin shalyad. You're going to cover it with your sleeve. But pirish she'im nikru begadav, if your beged is torn and therefore the tefillin shalyad is exposed, less lanba, we don't have to worry about it. Avalasa la'nichan ala beged, but certainly you're not going to put it on over your begadim. V'chanal b'sifhei. Okay, now we move along to Siman Chav Ches, Lamed Tes Amid Aleph, Siman Chav Ches, Dine Chalitzas HaTfillin, the halachos that apply to removing the tefillin. Ubay Gimel Seifim, and here we have 3 Seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Very strong words. Chayiv Adam. Person is chayiv, obligated. Not a minik toiv, not tzachiv. Chayiv Adam lemashmesh patfilin b'chol shah. Person is chayiv, he's obligated to touch, to feel his tefillin at all times. Why? Shalo yasiach daitoi mehem. So you should not remove your das from the tefillin. Now we'll have to see exactly what this means, but before we even get to that, let me read to you a Gemara in Menachos. Gemara in Menachos, Lamed Vav Amid Beis. This is taken straight from a Gemara. The Gemara says, Amar Rabba Bar Rav Huna, Rabba Bar Rav Huna said, Chayiv Adam lemashmesh batfillin b'chol shah. Person is chayiv to touch his tefillin at all times. Where do we know this from? Kal v'chaymer mitzitz. It's a kal v'chaymer learned from the tzitz hazav that the Kohen Gadol wore on his forehead. Uma tzitz she'ein bay ela azkar achas. The tzitz only had one shame of Hashem on it. The tzitz said Kodesh Lashem. So it mentioned the shame Hashem once. And yet, Amra Torah, the Torah Kedosha tells us, V'haya al mitzchay tamid, it has to be on his head, tamid, at all times. And we learn out from the word tamid, shaloi tasiach daitoi mimenu. What does it mean that it has to be on his head at all times? First of all, the Kohen Gadol did not wear the tzitz all the time. He wore the tzitz when he was wearing the rest of the Big Day Kahuna, when he was doing the Avodah, right? What does it mean al mitzchay tamid? He had to be aware that it was on his meitzach at all times. He couldn't be Mesiach Das. And that's the tzitz that only has one mention of Hashem's name on it. Tefillin, sheyesh ben azkaros harbe. So tefillin that have many mentions of Hashem's name. The Rambam tells us the Shem Hashem is mentioned in the tefillin 21 times. Halachos kama v'kama. Certainly, you can't be Mesiach Das from the tefillin shorosh. A very interesting thing, by the way, you see from this Gemara. Somebody would have stopped you and somebody would have asked you, what's more chashuv, the tzitz or the tefillin shorosh? I think a lot of people would have stopped them and said, oh, what do you mean, the tzitz hazav? Well, one of the 8 big day kahuna of the Kohen Gadol. What do you mean? How can you get more chashuv than that? It was worn lefnai or lefnim. Tefillin shorosh, everybody puts it on. Kohen Levi Yisrael every day. The tzitz has one azkara of the Shem Shamayim. To the tefillin has 21. And we're learning that Gemara and Menachos is giving us a kavachimer that the tzitz, the tefillin shorosh has a hecher chashivas than the tzitz. You know, so certainly we can't be Mesiach Das. So that's right away where this halacha comes from. This idea that you're not allowed to be Mesiach Das from the tefillin comes from the Gemara and Menachos, a kavachimer from the tzitz. Now, based on that idea, the Mechaber says, Chayiv Adam lemashmesh b'tefillin b'chol shah. You have to touch the tefillin at all times. Shalo yasiach daita mehem. So you shouldn't be Mesiach Das. What does this mean that you have to touch it b'chol shah? I mean, you have to be holding on to your tefillin at all times? Certainly not. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Aleph b'chol shah. Pirush, what does that mean? B'chol shah shenizkar bahem. Whenever you remember your tefillin, chayiv lemashmesh. Then you're chayiv to touch them. Da'yidei kain nizkar alein tadir. Because by doing that, you'll remember the tefillin all the time. V'lo yaveh lidei hesach hadas. And you won't come to hesach hadas. Now, reading the Mechaber and reading the Mishnah Berurah, it sounds a little funny. It sounds like what we're being told over here is, you have to touch your tefillin at all times. Certainly, it doesn't mean that you have to hold on to your tefillin all the time. So therefore, the Mishnah Berurah says, when should you touch your tefillin? When you remember them. Okay? Why should you touch your tefillin when you remember them? Oh, in order so that you shouldn't be Mesiach Das. If I'm touching my tefillin when I remember them, so right, that means I wasn't Mesiach Das. How is touching them when I remember them going to help me not be Mesiach Das? Something just seems like a little bit funny. So, you know this already about me, how I love the Aruch HaShulchan. So the Aruch HaShulchan says like this. Garcinon b'menachos, we learned in the Gemara Menachos Lamed Vav Amid Beis, Chayiv Adam lemashmesh b'tefillin b'chol shah, kal v'chaymer mitzitz. Person has to touch his tefillin all the time, kal v'chaymer from the tzitz. Umat tzitz shein bay ala azkar achas amar Torah v'haya mitzchay tamid shaloi tasiach daitei mimenu tefillin sheyesh ben azkaris harbe halachos kama v'kama. Ukvar kosfu harosh v'tamidei Rabbeinu Yoina b'shmoi. We already have a rush. And we have the Talmidei Rabbeinu Yoina who quotes the Rush, the Perek Gimel de Brachas, HaTorah lekabon Siman Mem Dalet, and we have the Torah also quotes his father the Rush. The hesach hadas loy mikri elikisha oimid b'schoik v'kalus rosh. What does hesach hadas mean? Hesach hadas does not mean what a simple reading of the Mechaber would lead you to think. Hesach hadas doesn't mean that you forgot that you're wearing your tefillin. That's not what hesach hadas means. Hesach hadas means schoik and kalus rosh. If you're acting in a way that is antithetical to tefillin, if you're acting with tzchoik and kalas roish, that's hesach hadas from tefillin. You're acting in a way that's completely antithetical to tefillin. Obviously, you don't realize that you're wearing tefillin. Or even if you realize that you're wearing tefillin, you don't understand what wearing tefillin means. So that's what it means to be mesiach das. Aval ena kavana sheyachshav korega ba'tefillin. But it does not mean that you have to constantly be thinking, I am wearing tefillin, I am wearing tefillin, I am wearing tefillin. This is not a directive to become OCD about wearing your tefillin. Sharei zeu me'anim nois. This would be a problem. Kishemispalo. How are you supposed to daven? How are you supposed to daven to the Rabban Shalom if you have to have in mind every minute, I'm wearing tefillin, I'm wearing tefillin? I limud. Or if you're learning Torah, which is a wonderful thing to do, to learn Torah with tefillin. I prepared shit today wearing my Rabbeinu Tam tefillin because I didn't put them on in the morning. So you're trying to learn, you're learning, you're trying, you're being ma'ayin in the Magen Avram, you're being ma'ayin in the Torah, but I have to think, I'm wearing tefillin, I'm wearing tefillin, I'm wearing tefillin. Obviously not. Harei machshavtoi bazeh. Your machshava has to be in your learning and in your davening. V'loi ba'tefillin, it can't be, your concentration can't be on your tefillin. Olachein, and therefore, heitirah chachamim b'sukkah, the Chazal are even matir, the Gemara in Sukkah Chavav Amud Aleph, Lishon Shinas Arai b'tefillin. Technically speaking, you're allowed to take a little bit of a cat nap while wearing tefillin. Certainly that has to qualify as hesach hadas. You're not thinking about your tefillin while you're sleeping. So certainly you're not mechuyev to be thinking about your tefillin every minute. Ella, kol she'ena oimid b'kalas roish les lamba. So the first thing that we have to understand is, what does it mean that we can't be mesiach das from tefillin? It does not mean, Rabbi say, that we have to think about our tefillin every minute. It means that we have to be acting in accordance with somebody who's wearing tefillin. We can't be behaving in a manner that's antithetical to tefillin. Then we're not wearing tefillin. Continues Yarach HaShulchan. V'tzarich loymar lefi zeh. According to this, you have to say, Hada amrinan shechayv lamashbish b'chol shah. This that we say that you're supposed to touch your tefillin all the time, hachi pirusha. This is what it means. B'chol shah shenizkar mehem. Whenever you remember them, chayv lamashbish. Then you have a chiyuv to touch them. And this, by the way, this wording is taken directly from a Bach. This is the Bach's wording. B'chol shah shenizkar mehem. Now, what's the point here? Explains Yarach HaShulchan. Kidei shaloi lavoi lidei hesach hadas. What this is a protection against coming to hesach hadas. Keloima. What it means is like this. Di'im gam b'shah sheyizkar lo yemashmesh. If you don't take a moment to touch your tefillin when you remember your tefillin. So, for example, you're sitting and you're preparing a Dirshu shir. You're sitting and you're learning daf yomi, and you're wearing tefillin, and you're mamish, you're concentrating on the daf. Maybe you took a look at a geshmak at Taisus. You had a kasha on the daf, and you looked at Taisus, you realized Taisus asked you a kasha, so you're looking at a Taisus. You're in the middle of learning the Taisus, and maybe you moved your arm and you saw your tefillin, or maybe your tefillin, the kricha is caught on the table. Or maybe your ritzua coming off of your shell roish draped onto the Gemara. Oh, tefillin. Tefillin? You remembered your tefillin? Feel your tefillin. Why? Because that creates... Yeah, it's true that you just remembered your tefillin, but when you remember your tefillin, make it more than just a fleeting thought. Oh, tefillin. That's not even mindful. When you when something makes you remember your tefillin, make yourself mindful of your tefillin. Take a moment and be memashmesh b'tefillin. Because the imgam b'shosha yizkar lo yemashmesh. Because if even when you remember your tefillin, you're not going to take a moment to touch them, yochal lishkayach aleim legamri. Eventually, you could come to forget about your tefillin completely. And that could bring you to acting in a way that's antithetical to wearing tefillin. Or to pass a gas, which you're not allowed to do while wearing tefillin. Or to fall into a shinas kva, which you're not allowed to do. So this is the thrust. how the Aruch HaShulchan explains this over here, right? What he's explaining is, realize that this doesn't mean that you have to touch your tefillin all the time. And it doesn't mean that you have to be thinking about your tefillin all the time. Because, hooray, you're allowed to daven and you're allowed to learn. But what it does mean is that when something points out your tefillin to you, take a moment and be memashbesh b'tefillin to be mindful of the tefillin, so you should not come to hesach hadas. Okay, continues the Mishnah Berurah over here is cotton olive va'oid, and there's another reason why it's important to touch your tefillin, kedei l'sakdam, so that you should be mindful of where they are, and you should fix them in the proper place, shelo yazuzu mimekaiman, so that they should not become removed from their proper placement. Ois cotton bei shelo yasiach daitoi. While you're davening, you don't have to touch them during davening. Okay, now we go further in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, near the end of the top line, that when you do feel your tefillin, you should always touch the shel yad tchila. Why is that? Very interesting reason. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton gimel, b'shel yad. Da shel yad smucha loy lamash b'shoy. Because generally speaking, which one of the tefillin are closer to your hand? Generally speaking, the shel yad is going to be closer to your hand. And we don't want to be maver ala mitzvahs. How many times have we learned about this lately? If you're going to go to touch the shel rosh first, now, mind you, you might have thought that there's a reason to touch the shel rosh first, because the shel rosh has more kedusha than the shel yad. Remember, we said the shel rosh has the shin of Hashem's name and the dalid in the kesher. And the shel yad only has the yud. And the shel rosh has 4 batim. The shel yad only has 1 bayis. So the shel rosh has greater kedusha. You might have thought touch the shel rosh first. Kamash Mallah, no. You can't be maver lamitzvah. So you cannot take your hand and pass by the shel yad to go to the shel rosh. There is a Dirshu footnote, interestingly enough. What happens if your hand happens to be closer to the shel rosh than the shel yad when you remember your tefillin and you want to be memashmesh? So there's poskim that say this way, poskim that say that way. But normally you would touch the shel yad certainly first. So Eis Katan Gimel, we're reading inside, Da shel yad smucha loy lamash b'shoy ve'ed mavirin ala mitzvahs. Eis Katan Dalet, you touch the shel yad tchila, va'achakach b'shel rosh, then you touch the shel rosh. V'im be'eis mishmosh shel rosh. Let's say you went there and you touched your shel rosh. Ooh, when you touched it, you realized that it's out of place. Mitza'u shedishpat mimakoymai. You just realized, oh, it's out of place, so now you want to move it back into place. V'noidaloi oz she'ashel yad gam ken nishmat mimakoymai. Maybe when you realize that the shel rosh is out of place, you might also realize, hey, you know what? My shel yad feels like it's out of place too. Which one should you put back first? Tzarech lahachzer shel yad tchila al mekoymai. You should first return the shel yad to its proper place. Mikra ukeshartam la'is al yodecha v'hadar l'taytafais beinenecha, because like we learned previously, you're supposed to have the shel yad in place first, v'hayu la'is al yodecha, and only then v'hayu l'taytafais beinenecha. V'chanal b'simen chafhei sif vav. Further in the Mechaber, Sif Aleph, second line, ukeshaymar ukeshartam la'is al yodecha. When you say Kriya Shema and you say ukeshartam la'is al yodecha, yamashmesh b'shel yad, you should touch the shel yad. Ukeshaymar v'hayu l'taytafais beinenecha, yamashmesh b'shel rosh, you should touch the shel rosh. Many people have the minhag to kiss, to touch the shel yad, kiss the shel rosh. There's a Dirshu footnote about this where they bring down, they don't see a makar for this. I saw a makar for it, and that is that it's a minhag Yisrael, and I saw Rav Moshe do it. That's good enough of a makar for me. And by the way, he didn't do this. He did this. So it's a kiss. It's a real kiss. Okay. Weiter, Sif Beis. By the way, they also discuss in one of the Dirshu footnotes, how about going to the mezuzah and kissing the mezuzah when you say "Chesavtam al mezuzah speisecha v'sharecha" in Kriya Shema? So I once heard, I think it was from Rav Beryl Wine. He was talking about minhagim, And he was quoting, I believe he was quoting one of the Gaonim, who said that there is no reason to kiss the Tefillin. Obviously, the Mechaber Paskin's not that way, but I think he quoted one of the Gaonim as saying that there is no reason to do it, and saying that if people are going to start doing that, then people are going to start getting up in shul and making a line by the door to kiss the mezuzah. In the middle of Kriya Shema. And Rav Wein, Zol Zayin Gesund, said that indeed there is a later source in the Kadmonim, I think it was by Svardim, to taka go kiss the mezuzah by Chesavtam al mezuzah Pesecha v'sharecha. Now, why taka? Why taka don't we go kiss the mezuzah? Chesavtam al mezuzah Pesecha v'sharecha. So there would seem to be a very clear difference, and that is that the whole concept of touching the tefillin is based on chayiv adam lemashmesh b'tefillin b'chol shah. So we have Medina Deshas. The Gemara gave us a chiv, the Rabbanon, lemashmesh b'tefillin b'chol shah. So we have a makar for the concept. Once we have a makar for the concept, it's very easy to say that when you say Kriya Shema and you say that's a good time that you should be mamashmish b'tefillin. Certainly, then you're going to remember your tefillin. So you remember your tefillin, go touch the tefillin. There is no dina deshas chayiv adam lamashmish b'mezuzah b'chol shah. There's no such concept that you're mechuyev to go touch the mezuzah. A very, very, very well-known asken. He's not alive anymore. I once went into his office and I kissed his mezuzah on the way in. He said, "Please don't kiss my mezuzah. It's a sterling silver mezuzah that was given that was donated by a very, very well-known supporter of Torah causes, and he gets upset when he comes to my office and he sees that it's tarnished. And from everybody touching it, it tarnishes very quickly. And there's no makar for touching the mezuzah." That's what he said. He said, there's no makar for touching the mezuzah. I told him, I said, if God's Klal Yisrael does it, don't tell me that there's no makar. But the point is, it's certainly not Dina de Shas. We don't have anywhere in Shas to go touch the mezuzah. But to touch the tefillin, we have. Okay, let's go weiter. Sif Beis. 3 lines down, middle of the line. Tefillin shel roish chayleitz tchila. When we remove the tefillin, we take off the shel roish first. Why? Everybody knows why already. Mishum diksiv v'hayulu taitafa ispein einecha. First, the pasuk says, "Ukisharta b'lo yisal yadecha." You tie the tefillin shel yad onto your arm, and then v'hayulu taitafa ispein einecha. And what we learn from the psukim is kol zman shebein einecha. Whenever you're wearing the tefillin shel roish, yiyu shtayim, there should be 2 tefillin. Why? V'hayu is lashon rabim. V'hayu l'taitafais bein einecha. So v'hayu l'taitafais. Whenever you have bein einecha, whenever you have tefillin on your roish bein einecha, it should be v'hayu l'taitafais. You should have 2. You should be wearing 2 tefillin. If you're going to take off the shel yad first, then you have the shel roish and you don't have 2. So you always take off the shel roish first. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton hay. Chayletz tchila, you take off the shel roish first. Achar shed meiser shalosh krichais meha etzba. First, you remove the 3 windings of the ritzua of the shel yad off of the middle finger. Then you take off the shel roish. Now, very interesting. The Mishnah Berurah quotes this in Sharet Zion's cotton hay. He quotes this from a Magen Avram, Upri Megadim. Chavetz Chaim never wrote an extra ois. He says, Magen Avram, Pri Megadim. The Magen Avram and the Pri Megadim. I'm just looking at other Sharet Zion's to point out to you, there are times that he doesn't use a vav when he adds others. But in any case, over here he says Magen Avram Upri Megadim. There's 2 different gersais in the Magen Avram. And in a lot of earlier texts of the Magen Avram says fakert. He says you should take off the shel roish before you take off the gimel krichos. Then there are other texts that say what we have here, that first you take off the krichos and then you take off the shel roish. The Pri Megadim quotes the later version. Others have the earlier version. In any case, I didn't find the tam for this, but this definitely does seem to be the way the Welt Ferzach, that you take off the windings on the fingers before you take off the Sharosh. Now we go weiter in the Mechaber in Sif Beis. Sarech lachloit tefillin sharosh mu'umid. When you take off the tefillin sharosh, you have to take off the tefillin sharosh while you are standing. Says the Mishnah Berurah mu'umad. You have to take off the sharosh while standing. Hu adin asaras hakrichai shelo etzba. So too, when you undo the windings of the ritzuah of the shalyad from the hand, you have to be standing. So don't do that while you're sitting, then stand up and take off the sharosh. No, you unwind the ritzuah from your fingers while you're standing and take off the sharosh while you're standing. And furthermore, says the Chavetz Chaim, according to our minig, shemanichin shalyad gam kein mu'umad, we put on the shalyad while we're standing. If you remember, we brought down different minhagim. There are Sfaidim who put on the shalyad while sitting and then put on the shalrosh while standing. But according to our minig that we put on the shalyad while standing, we have to take off the shalyad also while standing. The Mechaber only says to take off the shalrosh while standing. Says the Mishnah Berurah, according to our minig, you take off both the shalyad and the shalrosh while standing. The kahana chasan, kach chalitzasan, because the way you put them on, that's the way you take them off. There are those who take care to take off the shalrosh using their left hand, shehi biyad keha, so that they remove the shalrosh using their weaker hand. Why? Laharois shekasha alav chalitzasan, to show that it's difficult for me to remove the shalrosh. I don't want to take off the shalrosh, so I don't take it off with my strong hand. I take it off with my weak hand. That's what I do. I go to take off the shalrosh. I take the bias of the shalrosh with my left hand, and I remove it, and then I transfer it to my right hand to go and wind it up. V'emu iter yad, a lefty, shekam alachtoi b'smailoi, who does most of his work with his left hand, choltzan b'yaminoi, he should take off the shalrosh with his right hand, kedei shaloi lasoi sachalitza b'mihirus, so that he shouldn't be able to do it in a very, I guess the word would be dexterous. You don't want to be able to do it in a good way. You want to show that I really don't want to be doing this. Okay, let's go weiter in the Mechaber. Very interesting halacha, 2 lines from the bottom. V'yaniach batik shel roish va'olav shel yad. I'm going to have something to say about this. The Mechaber says that you should put away the shalrosh in its tick, in its container or its bag, the olav shalyad. Now, literally, this means that you should put the shalyad on top of the shalrosh. So you should have a container. You should put in the shalyad, and then put the you should put in the shalrosh, and then you should put the shalyad on top of it. Why? So everybody's already guessing why. Says the Mechaber, kidei, in order so that tomorrow when you go to put your tefillin on, yifka b'shalyad tchila. We want you to come across the shalyad before the shalrosh, because you got to put on the shalyad first. That way, when you put on the shalrosh, you should be wearing 2 tefillin. If you're going to come across the shalrosh first, you're going to have a problem. Mavirin ala mitzvahs. And over there, we said you're going to have no choice. You're going to have to put down the shalrosh and put on the shalyad first. So you're going to have to be maver ala mitzvahs. We don't want you to be maver ala mitzvahs. So, says the Mechaber, put in the shalrosh first, put the shalyad on top of it so that you encounter the shalyad first. Now, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Zayin. V'olav shalyad, Kosav Abach. The Bach writes, V'ched ataz le'el b'simul chafeis of Katan Yud. Dahainu, what this means is, Sheyase tik aroich v'tzar. You should make a long, narrow bag, Sheyu menach mizeh al gabe zeh, so that one is on top of the other. V'hamagen Avram Kosav, the Magen Avram writes, the yoser toiv litan hatfilin zeh b'tzad zeh. You should put one next to the other one. Not one on top of the other one. V'chein noyagin. And that is the minig. The minig is to put them next to each other. Umashe kosav ha-mechaber va'olav shel yad. And when the mechaber says that the shel yad should be olav, it should be on top of the shel rosh, perushoi, the explanation of his words is sheyitnoi ktsas litzad maila, that they should be next to each other, but the shel rosh should be a little bit out. It should be a little bit closer to you, kedei lifgaya behem tchila, so that you encounter. The shel yad should be a little bit closer to you, so that you should encounter the shel yad first. It does not mean that the shel yad should be on top of the shel rosh. Ubesefer Shulchan Shloimeh Kasav T'toiv sheyu Tefillin shel yad b'tzad yamin shel atik gam kein mitam zeh. We should put the shel rosh and the shel yad next to each other. The shel yad should be out a little bit further so that it's a little bit closer to you, and the shel yad should be on the right. And you know that the shel yad is always on the right, so you always go with your right hand and you go to the right first, so you'll encounter the shel yad first. You don't want to encounter the shel rosh first. I am not pleased with the minig. There is a minig, especially a minig. I don't want to use the word minig, but there's amongst, especially I see amongst youth, there is a version of a talus container, which to me, what it looks like is a thermos. Somebody told me that this is something that started in the IDF, and I'm not coming here to say anything against the IDF. This is not a political statement of any kind. Don't accuse me of being anti-Israel or anti-IDF, nothing to do with it. But somebody told me that this container first became popular in the IDF, maybe because they needed a tough container to protect their tefillin. I don't know. But I've seen a lot of people who have this container where taka, the tefillin, cannot go in next to each other. One goes on top of the other. And therefore they put the shel rosh at the bottom and they put the shel yad on the top. La'anias daiti, there's an issue with that. Because you're putting the shel yad, which has less kedusha, on top of the shel rosh, which has more kedusha. And we should not be doing that. And that's why we say over here, the yoser toiv litein atfilin zeh b'tzad zeh. They're supposed to be next to each other. And when the Mechaber says olav, he does not literally mean olav. He does not mean that the shel yad should be on top of the shel rosh. He means that it should be closer to you. It should be advanced. It should be forward of the shel rosh to avoid the problem of ein mavirin ala mitzvahs. Continues the Mishnah Berurah 3 lines down in the second column. And we're here in Ois Cotton Zayin. V'yesh na'agin, there are those who have the minig lase shnei kisin, to make two bags. Echad l'shel yad, one for the tefillin shel yad, ve'echad l'shel rosh, and one for the tefillin shel rosh. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, gam b'shnei kisin, even if you have them in two separate bags, still yoser tov sheyizar litan akish shel yad k'tzas l'tzad maila. You still have to put the bag for the shel yad a little bit closer to you, kedei sheyifka behem tchila, so that you should encounter it first. V'lo yavar la mitzvahs. T'das ataz le'el b'simen chafei degam al yedei kish shayich ma'avar la mitzvah. V'ayin b'magen Avram b'simen chaf hey sifkat na'alef. Oisan b'nei adam, those people hadei hagin lasos tikin lahatfilin, that make containers for tefillin. Yesh lehem l'samein eizer shayich l'shel rosh ve'eizer l'shel yad. You should be careful to know which one is for the shel rosh and which one is for the shel yad. Kedei sheyizar behem v'lo yotzi hashel rosh tchila me'atik, so that you should never mix up and take out the shel rosh first. So when we have these plastic boxes that we put them in, and they're labeled shel yad and shel rosh. Gam the kevan the shel rosh kedushasai chamura, and since the shel rosh has more kedusha, yizar al yedei zeh, this will lead us to be careful. Shaloi l'shanos achakach hatik litein by shel yad. You can't put the shel yad into the box of the shel rosh and the shel rosh into the box of the shel yad, because malin b'kodesh ve'ein meriden. If you take a box that was made for a shel rosh and now you use it for a shel yad, you're taking it a notch down in its kedusha. Same thing for those that have Rashi Tefillin and Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin. If you have a bag that was used for Rashi Tefillin, you cannot use it for Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, because Rashi Tefillin is a chiyuv, Rabbeinu Tam is a minig. Elohim kein histam et chilu kidla kaman b'simin mem beis. Ois cotton ches. The reason we have to be careful about these things is because we don't want to encounter the shal yad first. We want to make sure we encounter the shal rosh first. Ois cotton ches. Because if you do encounter the rosh first, we learned earlier, you're going to have no choice. You're going to have to put it down. Because you have to be mekayim the pasuk of Hayulu Taitafay Spain Necha. And you're going to have to be maver la mitzvah, so we don't want you to do that. V'nachar lizar, it is proper to take care, shelo yachloit shal yad, that you should not take off the shal yad, ad sheyaniach shal rosh b'say chatik. Very interesting. Chavetz Chaim says, do not take off the shal yad, put it down. Take off the shal rosh, put it down. Then take off the shal yad, put it down. And then wrap up your tefillin and put them away. You take off your shal rosh, wrap it up, put it in the bag. Then wrap up the shal yad and put the shal yad in the bag. Why? V'nachar lizar shelo yachlit shal yad ad sheyaniach shal rosh b'say chatik, kedei shelo yishkach v'yaniach shal yad tchila b'say chatik. Because we're afraid otherwise you might come to take the shal yad and put it into the tick first and mix up the sides. And you'll end up having the shal rosh where the shal yad usually is. And then tomorrow morning you'll accidentally take the shal rosh out first. Okay, I know that we're going over time, but I'm finishing the page. So we go to Sif Gimel, bottom line. Minig HaChachamim, it is the minig of Talmidei Chachamim. Lenashe katfillin, to kiss the tefillin. B'shas hanachasan, both when you put them on, u'b'shas chalitzasan, and when you take them off. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Tesh, u'b'shas chalitzasan, kishem mekapel tefillin. Now he tells us some other halachos, but negeya to wrapping up the tefillin. But first, I do want to point out to you, there are those that do not like the minig, that after you put on the shal yad, you take out the shal rosh, they don't want you to kiss the shal rosh before you put it on. Why? Because we learned that you're supposed to be memayit the hefsik between putting on the shal yad and putting on the shal rosh as much as possible. So to take a moment to kiss the shal rosh, they say, is to make a hefsik. The Yeshiva Zatzal, Rav Moshe said not that way. Rav Moshe said it's not a problem at all. To take out the shal rosh and show the chavivus hamitzvah, especially you have a mechaber, minig hachachamim lenashek tefillin b'shas hanachasan. You kiss the tefillin when you put them on. He doesn't say only the tefillin shal yad, right? So that means you're kissing the shal rosh also. So the Rishiv Zatzal kissed his shal rosh with a real kiss before he put it on, and he kissed them when he put them away. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Test, kishem mekapel tefillin, when we roll up the tefillin, lo yikrei charetzuais al habotim. You should not wind the ritzuas over the actual bias, the part that has the parshas in it. You should not wind the ritzuas on the bias. Ela bitstadei habotim ala titura. Rather, you should wind the ritzuas onto the base of the bottom that extends beyond the actual bottom. Why is this? Again, it's because of an inyan of kedusha. The bottom that contain the ritzuas are more kadosh than the ritzuas. So don't wind the ritzuas on the bottom. You wind the ritzuas on the titur. There are those that say that nowadays when we put the bottom into plastic boxes that we don't have to be makbid, because in any case we're not winding the ritzuas on the bottom. We're winding them on plastic boxes. Again, there are those that have the minig l'karchan kiknafayim, to wind up the tefillin like wings. What does it mean like wings? We have a wind of ritzua on each side of the bias, right? Like birds have wings on both sides. Why is that? Al shem kanfe yoina, as a remez to the wings of a yoina, the wings of a dove. What does this have to do with the wings of a dove? The answer is famous Gemara in Shabbos. Elisha bale knafayim. The Romans had passed a gzera not allowing Yidden to put on tefillin. Elisha bale knafayim, put on his tefillin in public. So a Roman officer came to kill him. He came to chase him. He ran away. And as he was running, he took off the tefillin. He was holding them in his hands. The centurion caught him. And he said, "What are you holding in your hands? Hey, Jew, what are you holding in your hands?" He said, "I'm holding kanfe yaina. I'm holding the wings of a dove." Why kanfe yaina? Because mitzvahs are nimshal to kanfe yaina. So the tefillin are a mitzvah. He said, "I'm holding kanfe yaina." The Roman centurion said, "Let me see." So he opened up his hands, and the tefillin had miraculously turned to a dove, and the dove came and flew out. So as a zecher, we tie the tefillin on both sides. We make a roll on both sides. Okay, some say that this is only negaya by the shalrosh, because apparently the nace happened with the shalrosh. When we do roll up the ritzuas on the sides, on the titura of the tefillin, you should hold the tefillin, v'ligloil haritzua alein, and roll the ritzuas onto the tefillin. V'loy lechais haritzua, don't hold the ritzua biyadai, v'ligloil ha-tefillin, and spin the tefillin. That's not derech hakavod. Gam kishenaitel ha-tefillin mikisan, also when you take the tefillin out of the bag, or when you take the tefillin out of the plastic boxes, lo yinarim, don't shake them out. Elanoitlon biyadai mitarech hakes, take them in your hand and draw them out. Tik tefillin also b'shel shatnus. You're not allowed to make a tefillin bag out of shatnus. Kamayim mit pachas sfarim. The same way you can't make coverings to sfarim out of shatnus. The reason is because we're afraid you might come to warm your hands when you're going and you're sticking your hand in or this or that. You might have hanoah from the beged, from the cloth of the tefillin bag, and therefore it should not be made out of shatnus. The last thing I want to mention here before I sign off, even though it's so overtime already, is that it always struck me watching Rav Moshe put away his tefillin. Many people wind up their tefillin mindlessly. Completely mindlessly. Rav Moshe wound up his tefillin like this. Every wind was a maisa. You're holding tefillin. Shem shamayim. More chashuv than the tzitz hazav. So you have to be mindful of what it is that you are doing. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should say, Yeshua Sefuos Parnaset Sheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Biyaskal Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu Amen. Be well.